Thank you. And when we are talking about 80s, we have to start with desires of socialist regime. And this speech by Nikita Khrushchev in 1961, when he announced that Soviet Union in the 80s will possess basic features of communism, means equal society. For sure, it means not only Soviet Union, means entire the socialist Eastern Bloc. Unfortunately, this never happened, and the reality of socialist Eastern Europe was slightly different and could be described through public buildings. I'm going to split those public buildings into three different branches. First is represented by high-profile buildings to promote socialist regime and its successes. On contrary, there were, let's say, ordinary utilitarian buildings for everyday life and for ordinary citizens to serve everyday needs, and usually the subject of prefabrication, standardization. And for me, the most interesting branch is in the middle, ambitious experimental buildings of moderate size, usually on prominent plots. I'm going to start with high-profile buildings and international hotels designed for foreign guests from all over the world, because the Iron Curtain was closed just for our citizens. And those hotels should serve as a promotion of socialist regime and its successes and quality of services was extremely high and comparable with Western Europe and international standards. And for example, this hotel Praha on the left side was originally designed for prominent political functionaries from all over Eastern Bloc. And you can imagine this standard was even higher, extremely high. And of course, it was closed for public and secret interiors until the end of the regime. In fact, this building was recently was bought by the richest man in Czech Republic and demolished, and now the lot is just a garden to his will. Similar role was played by, you can say, carefully selected and restored historic sites, especially spas and some special sites in the center of Prague, like Coronation Road, just to promote successes of socialist regime. And of course, during 80s, politicians knew that our economy is not such a huge success. They announced a few years ago. So they decided to focus only on selected building types which could promote the regime, and especially sports facilities for international events, because they could promote the regime and successes abroad, and also for domestic ones, because during late socialism, in this, you can say, boring socialist everyday life, those sports events, important international sports events, were some bright moment in everyday life, and especially when related to popular sports like tennis, ice hockey, rowing, ski jumps, and so on. And those sports facilities for international events were of special importance and the perfect opportunity for architects to introduce experimental structures and to introduce some striking design compared to Western high-tech. Of course, with some limitations, you can see on the picture in the middle that those architects decided to nickname themselves as low-tech, because in Eastern Europe, it couldn't be high-tech, just low-tech. And often this is some kind of mix of different styles and different technologies. You can see steel structures, light steel structures like high-tech, painted in bright colors, but filled with ordinary brown wooden cladding. And this is a very typical feature of our post-war architecture, this mixing of styles and different quality of materials and structure. Of very special importance were buildings related to culture and national history, because they helped Communist Party to depict socialism as a natural outcome and some kind of culmination point of our history, and some kind of legitimacy for communist rule. And this is the reason why those important buildings, historic buildings, were carefully restored, and usually some new additions were added and new volumes, usually modern architecture, but at the same time contextual, because there always had to be a bridge between past and contemporary communist rule. And culture also helped to hide real purposes of these buildings. For example, on the left, these huge buildings should serve for international congresses of Communist Party, but it was named Palace of Culture. You can imagine communist congresses as culture. Of course, during so-called normalization period after the occupation in 1968, it was very important to strengthen the power of Communist Party through headquarters of Communist Party. And these buildings were usually built in prominent plots as a result of massive demolitions. Usually designed by top local architects, but surprisingly with just standard budgets. So those impressive designs were applied only on facades to impress public, and sometimes in foyers. But the rest of these buildings is ordinary universal administrative building with some auditorium for political meetings. And should be said that those architects were ordinary employees of state design institutes. So they couldn't choose which building they will be involved, and what they will design. But some of them anticipated that communist rule will end soon, and those buildings should serve for different purposes. And this is why a lot of these headquarters now serve as universities, libraries, or some municipal offices. And you can imagine services for politically prominent figures and their families was even higher in quality, and of special importance were infrastructure buildings, because they were promoted by media as advanced architecture compatible with Western Europe, and Of course, opening ceremonies served as a great opportunity for functionaries. Those buildings were named after politicians, and should be said that those were the only buildings that actually served general public, even high-profile buildings. Those were high-profile buildings, prominent buildings. On contrary, everyday life for ordinary citizen was quite depressive during normalization, usually represented by housing estates with a huge pressure on quantity. It was based on economic plans and on numbers of flats to be built per year. So this is the reason why very often public buildings, for public buildings, there was no energy nor money. But at the same time, architects perceive the public buildings as the only opportunity to improve environment in housing estates. And fortunately, during 60s, research institutes and some building companies developed and tested prefabricated frames. So these frames should be completely universal and should be used for every public building in next 20 years. Actually, 3 of them were introduced into mass production, and you can find those 3 frames all over Czech Republic during 70s and 80s. Of course, architects hated those prefabricated structures because of rigidity of the structure and because of, let's say, poor quality of architecture. But soon they have no opportunity to choose another structure, so they have to deal with it. And they tried to study manuals, looking for loopholes and looking for some possibilities to use those frames more creatively. And in fact, after soon they knew how to deal with them. For example, those 2 buildings are based on the same frame in a completely different context, so housing estate and historic square, box and pitched roof, but inside there's the same frame, the same ordinary prefabricated structure. All of these frames were of very poor quality of execution, so architects tried to cover them with some more creatively designed facade, and usually with some cladding, usually with some ceramic tiles. And passage for art was very helpful for them, so they tried to collaborate with artists, like on the left side, or this architects in the middle decided to take advantage of very poor quality and different colors of those tiles and to make it more creative and restless and playful. And a lot of those architects decided to use tiles intended for different purposes. For example, on the right side, those tiles were developed for swimming pools, and those architects used them on facade. For young architects, those prefabricated frames or prefabricated structures was the only opportunity for if they wanted to design public buildings or humanize housing estates. So they tried to cover them with some paints, some colors, or to cover them with steel or wooden profiles, and with some forms like loggias, portals, towers, to make it more familiar and more human to locals. and especially those small public buildings in the middle of housing estates were of very special importance. So you can see in the middle there's a scrapyard, ordinary scrapyard assembled from panels, but at the same time it's perfect human public building in the middle of housing estates. Usually those buildings were some kind of strange mix of prefabricated frames, panels, this mix of postmodernism, constructivism, high-tech, sometimes some rural architecture like on the right. So this is very typical blended architecture. Standardization was successful only in case of a small sports home. You can see this is a really good architecture spread all over Czech Republic, and most of these buildings are still in use. Of course, sports buildings of moderate or middle size are usually a perfect opportunity for improvisation and for experimentation, especially with large span constructions. And sometimes it was perfect opportunity for some new challenges like sustainability. On the right side, you can see swimming pool in Tachov, which is shaped according to sun. On south facade, there's a trombe wall. On north facade, there's a huge, massive insulation on the roof. There are solar panels, and it still serves perfectly. So in the 80s, sustainable architecture. Again, some kind of strange mix of postmodernism, high-tech, of steel profiles, and ordinary brown wooden cladding. So significant for architecture. And similar example is culture houses. Every culture house was completely different. They served for political meetings and controlled culture, but at the same time, so those buildings are still in use. So they are usually some kind of landmark and social hub in small cities. And again, these buildings could serve as experimentation. On the right side, there's again a building with solar facades. We have some really beautiful, romantic, small public buildings, usually designed by young architects and usually built by them. Together with local volunteers during weekends and holidays, just to improve environment of villages or housing estates. And very often those buildings were designed together and built together with artists. So it sounds like a strange architecture of strange time in small country in the center of Europe. But you can imagine those ambitions put into architecture are similar in 19th century, in inter-era, in post-war architecture, in contemporary architecture all over Europe. There are always high-profile buildings, ordinary buildings, and something between, which is perfect for experimentation and new challenges. And I think we have to focus on these buildings because high-profile buildings are usually protected, usually well-maintained, usually under control, political control, social control. Those utilitarian, ordinary buildings usually casually served until some renovation or demolition is needed. But those middle-sized buildings, experimental, more ambitious in prominent plots, are very special for local communities and for architecture. and perfect opportunity and commitment, of course. So how we deal with them? Not really good. In fact, those buildings are still too big for contemporary lifestyle, and a lot of them are empty or were privatized. A lot of these buildings are too expensive to maintain or to use them. So owners help themselves through some commercial activities, regardless of original authentic architecture qualities or values. Maintenance is done step by step with cheap products, low budgets, and without knowledge of architecture qualities or values we are dealing with. And I think this is extremely dangerous because when you change the building slowly, step by step, something is missing, something is diluted, and nobody will remember original state and qualities. You can imagine public space is not perceived as an integral part of those buildings. And for a renovation, we usually use some certificated, smooth, contemporary facades, of course, without evaluation how much energy is needed for production of new facades and how much energy consumption is needed for demolition and so on. And it's just the only way we do it, because sometimes it's on purpose, because we want to erase all vestiges of communism. And a lot of these extraordinary structures have already been demolished, of course, like everywhere. Of course, we have some positive examples, more or less positive, like those with original functions, usually with some new facades, copies of original facades, and this is just usually some coincidence. Like, for example, on the left, there's a research institute which is protected. Original architect was involved in a renovation, and this institute is very rich because they have some money from licenses and some research. And Czech Technical University campus is similar situation because during reconstruction works, white sector was a historian of modern architecture. Actually, my supervisor and my dissertation thesis was focused on the building. So they knew qualities they are dealing with. Of course, we have some examples of new use or reuse. And I think some buildings offer the opportunity not to change everything. Because, like, for example, churches, markets, department stores, there is usually no need for insulation or for some new refurbishment. They could just serve, like this one, including all these vestiges of time and using, or like this one, metro station. And for me, most important moment is that young people and communities gradually adopted those buildings, and now these buildings are not perceived as, for young people, as communist heritage, as interesting buildings that could just serve communities. And this brings me to some numbers. So to conclude, in Czech Republic, we have 47,000 listed buildings, and just 76 are built in post-war era. And most of them are built in Stalinist 50s. So there's a gap in our protection. And we can talk about wasting. In Czech Republic, about 22 million tons of construction waste are produced per year. It means a wall with thickness of 1 meter and height 7 meters around all the border. Every year, just 1/4 is recycled. You can imagine that if post-war architecture is very important heritage, it's almost half of the building stock. So we have to find some strategies how to reuse it or how to use it. And maintenance is quite poor. Just 1/4 of investments into construction works. Most of them are new buildings. Czech Republic is quite successful and responsible with the highest possible ranking in strategies for sustainability. We have this dark green in the middle of Europe, but in fact, it's focused mainly on residential buildings. You can see it on the right side, that public buildings, there are almost no strategies. And in case of residential buildings, it means usually insulation, new windows, and new heating system. That's all. And if this is the highest level of strategy, public contracts are usually focused on infrastructures like highways and water supplies. You can see this light green is culture and education, just a small part of public investment. And this brings me to quality of life in Europe. When you can see these figures and this data, in the long run, everything goes. This is why those public buildings are extremely important, because with highest possible level of quality of life, we need public buildings. To conclude, we have to focus on communities. We have to focus on long-term view, on systematic maintenance. We have to consider architectural value. We have to take a maximum benefit of existing elements. We have to reuse these buildings or sometimes just simply to use them. Thank you for attention.